Children's Institute in the University of Cape Town released its annual Child Gauge report last week. That report provides an annual overview of the status of South Africa's youth and children. Now, one of the issues that were in the report this year included the intergenerational transmission of poverty and how it affects young people. Now, let's find out from our guest in studio. We are joined by the senior researcher Lauren Graham from the Center of Social Development at the University of Johannesburg. Well, she's in our Cape Town studio this morning. A very good morning to you, Lauren, and welcome.
Thank you.
Now,
and
Lauren,
good morning to your viewers.
Lauren, take us through on how the Child Gauge report was compiled.
The Child Gauge report is compiled each year. Normally it focuses on children under the age of 18. This is the 10th publication of the Child Gauge, and so because the gauge was coming of age, we decided this year to focus on 15 to 24-year-olds, young people coming of age, and to look at what the born-free generation is looking like. It brings together researchers from different universities to comment on areas of their expertise and put together some policy recommendations.
So you're looking at the born-frees, but what is meant then by the intergenerational transmission of poverty in that report?
Well, what we see looking across the essays, and the essays include information on education, post-secondary education, unemployment and health. And what we're seeing is a pretty bleak picture, unfortunately, that young people who are born to parents who live in circumstances of poverty have every chance of falling into poverty themselves, that they access low quality education that limits their chances of getting into post-secondary education and training, and ultimately falling into long-term unemployment or underemployment with consequent poverty. And that, of course, then gets transferred onto their children. So what we argue in this gauge is it's really important that we look at mechanisms to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of poverty at this key phase of transition in a young person's life.
And how do we do that?
We make various recommendations here. One of the things that is really important for us to look at is social protection. So we see the very positive benefits of various social protection mechanisms like the child support grant and the old age pension on various outcomes for children. But we know that children at the age of 18 exit out of the child support grant, and there's very few, besides basic services, there's very few social protection mechanisms in place to provide some kind of stepping stone to support young people to autonomous livelihoods. There's obviously interventions we need to make at the basic education level, changes that need to happen with post-secondary education and training with a far greater focus on TVET, the TVET system, for instance. In the unemployment chapter, we look at some very promising initiatives from civil society, the private sector, and the state, who are running employability programs outside of the formal post-secondary education and training space that are directly targeted at young people who can't access formal post-secondary education and training. And those are intended to help young people to take that step into employment.
Is that perhaps a suggestion to extend the child grant to a youth grant? And won't that perhaps then turn us into a nanny state?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and of course there's still a lot of research that needs to go on to see whether we should be extending the child support grant. There's cases for extending it. For instance, if you think of a young person turning 18 in a middle class family, that young person is not prepared to enter the workforce at that stage. So perhaps a bit of a longer period of financial support might help young people. I don't think that extending the child support grant on its own is going to make much of a difference. At some point that has to be cut off, and then what do young people do? We really need to be focusing on investing state resources into other support mechanisms for young people. If you look at the Fees Must Fall campaign, what are we doing about making sure that young people can access post-secondary education and training, which means they'll have a much better chance of finding employment? What are we doing to connect young people to employment or entrepreneurship opportunities? So other interventions that need to support young people to take those steps into autonomous adulthood.
But what are some of these underlying causes that relate to many young people coming out of poverty or are in poverty?
A lot of it, as we know, is rooted in the apartheid policies of the past, particularly the exclusion of their parental generation from the labour market and from higher up positions in the labour market. And so the Africanization of poverty that apartheid bred in South Africa has a large role to play. But also in post-apartheid South Africa, the way we've addressed youth development has been in a sort of uncoordinated fashion. So we used to have the Umsobomvu Youth Fund and the Youth Commission, that then became the National Youth Development Agency. We've had various iterations of the National Youth Policy, with the latest one being signed in this year. But we really haven't seen any concentrated and coordinated way of intervening in young people's lives. And so even the NYDA today is mandated to do everything, and therefore can't do much. They don't have teeth to be able to ensure that youth development is happening in a coordinated fashion. We're yet to see we've seen a very nice national youth policy, but we're yet to see what the implementation plan is going to look like. And if we don't get a good implementation plan in place, we risk following the same trajectory for the next 5 years.
Lauren, thank you so much for your time. That was the senior researcher Lauren Graham from the Centre of Social Development at the University of Johannesburg, but she's